Getting a higher yield from a vegetable garden or growing space is a fairly common goal for many people, often based on an intuitive belief that more is better. In some cases, there can be a real focus on trying to increase the amount of food that can be grown in a limited area, especially in urban and peri-urban areas. We also tend to want to get as much as we can from the efforts that we put in, and perhaps to leave space for others to grow food or for other uses and more natural ecosystems. And in times of stress or need, there can be an extra push to produce as much as possible with the land and resources that we have available. There are a number of different approaches to achieve this goal, but the one that I use for the intensive garden that forms part of this Red Gardens project follows a method originally developed by John Jebbings and then has been adapted since then. This method involves deeply digging fixed beds in the garden and adding lots of compost within the full depth of the loose and friable soil that is created, so that it can support a higher density of plants to produce a greater abundance of food. A succession of plants are transplanted into the soil to make the most of the growing season, and it's my job as a grower to provide everything that is needed for these plants to grow as quickly and abundantly as possible. I quite like the aims and approach of this gardening method, and I think that the drive to maximize productivity can be really useful, especially these days. In many ways, I've been quite successful at adapting this intensive method to this site and climate, but I have become aware of a number of issues that may be preventing this intensive garden from being as productive as it can be. Over the years, I've generally been able to produce more food in this garden than I have from most of the other family-scale gardens, especially compared to the adjacent extensive gardens, which follows a very different approach of focusing on quality rather than quantity. Looking at a range of different vegetables that were largely successful in both of these gardens last season, the intensive garden did produce significantly more than the extensive garden did. There are a few things that I failed to do that would account for part of the significantly lower yields in some of the crops in the extensive garden, and there are also some issues that prevented the yield from the intensive garden from being even higher. But overall, these crops produced an average of 70% more in the intensive garden than in the extensive garden, and that is definitely significant. Most of this is due to the higher density of plants or how close the plants are spaced together, and in general there is almost twice as many plants in the same area in the intensive garden as in the extensive garden. This produced a greater overall harvest, even if the individual vegetables tended to be smaller or there was less harvested from each plant. This extra yield in a limited area does come at a cost of a lot more effort in this garden, especially double digging the soil and preparing the beds. But if the space is limited and time is abundant, then this isn't necessarily a problem. Double digging is a time-consuming and labor-intensive task, involving digging a trench, loosening the soil at the bottom of the trench, and often incorporating compost into this lower level, and then filling the trench with the soil from the next section of the bed. I also dig more compost into the upper layer of the soil, or add it to the surface of the finished bed, depending on the quality of the compost and the crop that I'm planning to grow. In total, I spent about 23 hours preparing the beds and adding compost in this garden last year, which is substantially more than any of the other gardens, and sometimes I wonder if it's worth the effort. After the first few seasons, double digging theoretically becomes less necessary, or there is less additional benefit to this digging, especially now that I've removed most of the stones from this garden. But I generally like to continue to put in this effort, more as an exploration to see what will happen, and last year I spent a time to fully prepare the beds, as I hadn't been so consistent with the digging and adding compost for the previous few seasons. Last month I took soil samples of all the main growing spaces that I manage, and sent them off to a lab for detailed tests of the mineral content and fertility holding capacity of each sample. It was the first time in quite a few years that I had done a soil test of this garden, and I was quite pleased that the levels of phosphorus and potassium were very close to the target that I'd figured out based on some specific recommendations that I've been following. There is also plenty of magnesium and adequate levels of calcium, which is to be expected with this limestone-based soil that has a naturally high pH. The levels of sodium and some of the other trace elements are lower than recommended, and sulfur is quite low, but this seems to be quite typical with this soil that I'm working with. While I have been regularly adding additional fertility amendments to some of the other gardens, I generally only add compost to this intensive garden, except when I think that the compost is not very rich, in which case I tend to add in some chicken manure pellets as well. It takes a lot of effort and resources to produce so much compost, or money to buy it in, But according to the theory and widely held assumptions, this is worth the effort or cost. The more compost I add, the more nutrients the soil should be able to hold on to, as well as there being more food for the soil biology and for the plants, and the soil should be able to hold on to more water. All of this is supposed to improve the soil so that the plants can be healthier and more resilient and more productive, and I can harvest more food, but that doesn't seem to have happened. In the soil test for this intensive garden, the levels of soil organic matter was found to be 10%, which is actually lower than what was found in the extensive garden. And the cation exchange capacity of the soil, which is a measurement of the fertility holding capacity of the soil, is essentially the same in both gardens, at about 11. Both of these results were surprising to me, and to be honest, a bit disappointing and confusing, as the soil hadn't improved as I expected it would. Last year, like most seasons, I added more than double the amount of compost to the soil of the intensive garden than I'd added to the extensive garden. But this didn't result in more organic matter being left in the soil, and I wonder what happened. Some of this compost was added to the lower level of the soil, so would not have been measured in the sample I took. But even comparing the amounts added to the top layer of soil, a lot more was added to this intensive garden. It could be, as some people suggest, that the levels of a soil organic matter can't increase much beyond what would be naturally present in this type of soil and in this climate, and perhaps I'm coming close to hitting the upper limits in the cases of these two gardens. But the soil in the polytunnel garden has had steadily increasing amounts of soil organic matter over the years, reaching a high of more than 12% this year, and the cation exchange capacity has risen to 14 instead of 11. Perhaps the warmer conditions in the polytunnel microclimate could be a factor, but I would have thought that the warmth would have caused even more of the organic matter to be consumed with the biological activity. Digging the soil can apparently increase the loss of organic matter, but I've been digging the soil in the polytunnel garden about as thoroughly as I do in the intensive gardens, so that doesn't seem to account for it. I don't really know what's going on here, but I suspect that it's somehow related to fertility issues. As I regularly add additional concentrated fertility to the soil of the polytunnel garden and in the extensive garden, not as much of the compost is needed to feed the plants, so perhaps that is why more of the compost I add stays in the soil in some form of organic matter. But I wonder if it's a few particular nutrients rather than the general range of fertility that is causing this difference. And if I want the levels of soil organic matter in the intensive garden to increase the way that they have in the polytunnel garden, then perhaps it's possible to use the soil tests as a guide to figure out what might be missing. Comparing the levels of 11 elements found in the soil test to what would be the target levels for each of these gardens, some elements are in significant excess in both gardens, and for others quite similar levels have been found, so these are unlikely to account for the differences between these gardens. There are lower levels of boron, copper, and zinc in the intensive garden, as well as sodium, so any of these might be a factor, and the differences in phosphorus might also be an issue, even though there seems to be enough of this major nutrient in the intensive garden. But it is the significant differences in the levels of sulfur that might be the best candidate for why the soil organic matter is increasing in one garden, but not in the other. Overall, I'm quite pleased with what I've been able to harvest from this garden. But as usual, there's always room for improvement and for exploring different ways that I might be able to further increase the yields. Because the nutrient holding capacity of this soil has not increased the way that I thought it would, I'm hesitant to increase the density of plantings even more, or to grow more plants in the same area, at least for now. And it seems that I need to continue to add large amounts of compost to this garden in order to maintain the current yields. I could add supplemental sources of fertility to feed the plants, including liquid feeding the plants during the growing season, though I'd rather rely on using compost to feed the soil and the plants with this gardening method. I think I'm going to try adding some sulfur to amend the soil, and perhaps some seaweed dust to bring up the levels of a wide range of trace elements that might be missing, in addition to the usual amounts of compost, and it will be interesting to see if this has any impact. Beyond these fertility issues, there is a lot that I can do to improve this succession planting, to grow 2 or 3 crops in a season in each section of the garden, and this can be improved even more by making use of temporary crop protection, including mini polytunnels. For me, this is an exercise in trying to figure out how I can get the most out of this garden in ways that are broadly compatible with this particular gardening method. And with all of the dramatic changes that are happening around the world, I feel that it's even more important to try to figure out how to get around some of the limits that might be holding things back.